Hun skal I dag snakke om kjønn kan påvirke stressets rolle I eksamensprestasjoner. Så da tenker jeg at vi gir henne en varm applaus.
Ja. Tusen takk. Jeg skal snakke på engelsk. Jeg fra Colombia, så det en litt vanskelig for meg å snakke om forskning på norsk, så dessverre. So, my name is Catalina Franco. I'm a researcher at FAIR, the Center of Excellence FAIR at the Norwegian School of Economics, and SNF, which is the Center for Applied Research, also at the Norwegian School of Economics. And one of my topics of interest is stress and exam performance, specifically gender differences in this dimension. So to start, I would like you to think about a situation that you had in the past where maybe you were going to take a test or you were going to do a race, give a presentation, and a lot in your life would be determined by your performance in this situation. So maybe it was a career trajectory change, maybe your entire life could change. How did you feel before going into that situation? I can tell you for me, I was preparing for my PhD in economics, and we have to take an exam to be competitive for this type of PhD programs. And you know that if you don't score above the 95th percentile, that is at the very, very top, you may not get a chance at the best schools, at least in the US. So I remember that preparing for this exam, I was feeling, if I was driving, I was feeling that all the cars would come to me. I was feeling this type of stress all the time, even when I was not preparing for the test. And I'm honestly not a stressed person, a nervous person, but this type of thinking that my whole life, my whole career will be determined by this test was a lot to deal with. So, of course, this type of situations are characterized by high stakes. A lot is at stake when you are going into these situations, and that can generate high pressure. So the question here, and this has been in the minds of a lot of psychologists, but also economists, is why do we sometimes fail to perform at our best when it matters most? So when you really want to do it well, you find yourself not doing it so well as you had done in the past, for example. So what is the issue with these high-stakes exams? You have these exams in Norway, for example, and you see a lot of students preparing a lot for these exams. They put in the hours, they put in the effort, they have high motivation to perform well. They know that if they perform well, they're going to have access to educational opportunities that they don't if they don't perform well. And they can get access to top schools. They can, maybe in other countries, prestigious study tracks. It can be very consequential for their future, not only educational opportunities, but also economic opportunities. What kind of job they're going to get later on in life. What kind of connections they can make at the school where they end up studying. However, some of these students cannot perform at the same level that they had performed in the past when the pressure was not on, when the pressure is on. So how do we understand stress in this context? There's an already defined term called choking under pressure. This is coming from the psychology literature, and I'm using the definition of Baylock. She's a psychologist who has worked a lot on this type of stress situations. And what she says in her book, Choke, is this is the suboptimal performance that occurs in response to the perceived stress of a situation. What does it mean, suboptimal? It means that you perform worse than was expected, given what you are capable of performing or what you have done in the past. Suppose, as a student, you take practice tests before the real test, and you perform at a certain level, but somehow in the real test, your performance cannot be as high as it was before. Or maybe you are there's some underlying ability that you have, and you cannot reach that level in the real test. And we are not talking here just about a fluctuation in the skill. That can happen. You can have a bad day. Sometimes we have good days, we have bad days. But this is not that. This is not a random fluctuation in your performance. It's a response to a highly stressful situation, such as my life, my career is going to be determined by my performance in this test. There are two important ingredients. One is there are large incentives for excelling, so you are motivated to put all your effort in. And if you don't perform well, there are negative consequences. For example, you don't manage to get into the school of your dreams or into the program of your dreams, so you have to go to another less preferred alternative. So how does this happen? And again, if you have the chance and you're interested, the Baylock book called Choke from 2010 is very nice to describing this to the general public. So she says, first, it could be paralysis by analysis. And here, think of a sports setting. Think of maybe basketball. You have tried many, many times how to throw the ball. But somehow, when you are in this defining point in the match, you start thinking about how do you put your hands, how are you moving your feet. You start thinking a lot about how does this movement that is usually very fluid works. So something that's very automatic becomes overthought and overanalyzed, and you are trying to control everything in your body so that you successfully get the point. And guess what happens when you try that, something that you have done many, many, many times, then you are much more likely to fail it. Another way in which this type of pressure can affect performance is by depleting brain power. So think about your brain as having a set of resources that you can use to do any task that you want. Let's think of a cognitive task. You are taking a test and you are trying to solve a question in the test. So imagine that the question, maybe it's a bit hard, and all the brain power that you can be used to answer this question basically goes away and starts thinking, what if I fail this test? What are my parents going to say? What am I going to do? So a lot of these self-centered and task-irrelevant thoughts arise, and hence you lose focus on the task at hand, which is solving the question that you are trying to solve in the test. So this working power from your brain that should be devoted to problem solving, solve the question, is redirected to controlling worry. You start worrying about the consequences of failing, and hence you cannot use your brain power to solve the question at hand because it's going towards controlling the worry that's coming up. So here it's important to introduce this concept of working memory, because this is exactly what the definition of choking is talking about. So this is a core cognitive function, and what it does is allowing us to keep information in the mind temporarily and then work with this information. So you may have a lot of things in your mind, but working memory is going to allow to keep some facts in mind while you are reading the rest of the question, for example. So what we know from previous research is that this working memory is fragile. It's not always constant, or is not always available in the same way. You can only keep track of a few pieces of information at the same time. You cannot remember everything at the same time. It can fade away within seconds. For example, in what I was saying before about you start worrying about the negative consequences of performing badly in this test, it goes away, the information that you were using to work on the question at hand, and can be pushed out by distracting stimuli, for example, these worryings that can arise in a test. What's interesting is that it's been shown that it predicts school performance. So people with high working memory can perform much better in school. And it can account for 50 to 70% of differences in abstract reasoning ability. So this seems to be one of the core functions of the brain to explain differences in academic performance. And then the question is, I started the talk saying this is something about gender. Why do we think choking under pressure may differentially affect men and women? Well, we know from self-reported surveys that women tend to express higher levels of academic anxiety, not only in math, but related to tests more in general. So women tend to feel more anxious about these academic situations. Then an interesting report from the OECD in 2018 that asked these students, 15-year-old students around the world who take these PISA tests, about fear of failure. And they find that women or girls report a much higher fear of failure than boys. And fear of failure means that if you don't perform well in these academic settings, hence you fail, you're going to be worrying about the consequences of this failure. Another OECD report also says that students with high motivation, and remember in this choking under pressure definition, motivation was important because this is the highly motivated students, the ones that may be more at risk of choking under pressure. So those who have high motivation to achieve also tend to be those who feel anxious about taking a test, even if they are well prepared for it. That's the other ingredient that we mentioned before. Students put in the hours, they put in the effort, they are highly motivated, and somehow this combination is what makes them fail in the end. In the PISA 2012 test, so PISA does these tests across many countries in the world regularly, the OECD does the PISA tests I think it's every year. From the 2012 version, girls in all the countries that were tested, these are many, many countries, but only not in 9 countries, reported higher anxiety towards math than boys. So all over the world, except in a few places, girls have higher math anxiety than boys. And this greater math anxiety is correlated with a decline in 34 score points in these PISA tests, which is equivalent to almost a year of school, 1 year of school. So the performance that women are not gaining by being anxious is equivalent to being basically 1 year below in school relative to boys. So this is important. So what do we know about gender differences in this type of high-stakes, high-pressure exams? So one recent paper from China shows that women's performance declines when the stakes are high. How do they do this? In China, to get access to college, you need to take a college entrance exam. This is a big deal in China. You can imagine that there are millions of students who are preparing for these tests and who are taking this test every year to get access to college in China. This is the only way to get admission into college, your performance in this test. So this is where the stakes are high. Basically, no matter how much effort you put in for many years in school, what matters for admissions to college is your performance in one test, the Gaokao exam. So what this, because it's a big deal, a lot of municipalities or the administration in China, they do a mock test about 2 months before the real Gaokao exam. So what the researchers did was use one of these mock tests to measure what was the performance of boys and girls 2 months before the real test, and then see how this performance compares to the performance in the real Gaokao exam 2 months later. What do they find? Well, relative to the performance in the mock test, women's performance declines by 0.15 standard deviations relative to the mock exam in the Gaokao exam. That's a big change. For men, the change was not much. If anything, the performance between the real exam and the mock test went up by a little bit for the boys. And something that was very interesting is that there are certain cutoffs to get access to better schools in China. Specifically, for example, Tier 1 and Tier 2 schools, these are the top schools in China. When women were closer to the cutoffs that will leave them access to these higher tier universities, the decline in performance was bigger. It was not 0.15 standard deviations, it was 0.3 standard deviations. So it was twice as big. So when the pressure of maybe having the chance of getting into a better school is on, meaning you are performing close to one of these cutoffs, the decline in performance is much larger. This suggests that the pressure story, this choking under pressure story, may be behind the female underperformance in high-stakes exams. So what happens, for example, among admissions to a Tier 1 university, the gap increases by 15%, gender gap in admissions increases by 15% relative to what would have been the gap if the scores that were used for admissions would be those used from the mock exam. So basically, pressure increases the gap in getting access to high educational opportunities, such as getting access to these important universities in China. So what is the difference between the low stakes and high stakes? Usually when we talk about low stakes, we are talking about exams that don't really count, for example, in the final grade, or a mock test that is not really going to count for anything other than just to know how well you are performing. So what we know from the economics literature is that women outperform men in less competitive low-stakes tests. For example, women tend to have higher GPAs or higher high school grades than men. But when it comes to these more competitive, higher stakes tests, women perform worse. In fact, sometimes the gap reverses by men outperforming women. So we have some evidence from different countries. For example, in a selective entrance exam to a top business school in France, we see that women had better grades in the regular classes, but in this exam, men were performing much better than women. In Spain, we have different stakes measured by what's the weight of an exam in the final grade. So the low stakes would be exams, for example, that are worth 5% of the grade. But when the final comes, and that is 30% of the grade, we see that women and men are performing the same, but before, in these other 5% worth exams, women were performing much better than the men. And also in Spain, we see that they have some math competitions, and you see that the higher the round in the competition, for example, the first round is like a more basic round, then the second round is a more demanding round. When women go from one round to the next, a more competitive round, basically they perform worse than the men, and they were performing the same in the beginning. So we have now a lot of evidence from different countries that this is a widespread phenomenon. This is not only in China, because it's a very particular country, this is something that's happening in many places around the world. And of course, you cannot observe choking under pressure directly, but all of these studies conclude that the most likely reason for this underperformance is the differential response to pressure by women than by men. You can think now, well, maybe this gender gap in performance could be due to other things. What could be these other things? Some people, the first thing that it would come to their minds would be, well, maybe this is difference in underlying ability. For example, maybe men tend to be smarter than women for biological reasons, let's say. So, in particular, the high-performing men or male students may have higher ability than the high-performing female students. And let's think for a moment about that. Maybe you remember from when you were in school, who were the bright students? Who would you thought the bright students were? A lot of people would think that maybe men were, or boys were the brightest students. Maybe they were the ones who were speaking up more in class. They seemed more confident when they were asking a question or answering some question. Maybe they were going on the board in a math class and they were much likely higher, having the right answer in front of everyone. And you will see, well, if that's the case, then this advantage would show in the higher stakes exam, because maybe this exam is more discerning of the ability of the underlying ability of students. And actually, this was an argument used in the past, even by the rector of Harvard University, saying that, well, men at the top of the distribution, like among the more intelligent, men are more intelligent than women. Where did they base this from? So they were seeing this SAT math exam. The SAT is an exam in the US that is used to get access to college, but it's not the only thing that gives you access to college. They have letters of recommendation, they have grades from high school, etc. Still, this is an important component of admissions in the US. And what people saw was, among students who were scoring 700 or above, this is the 95th percentile, meaning that 95% of the population were scoring below 700 points. So we are looking at the top of the distribution here, and we are comparing boys and girls. How many boys were there at that level, and how many girls were there at that level? And what they saw is that the ratio of boys to girls was 13 to 1 girl. For every girl, there were 13 boys scoring at 700 or above in the 1980s. And then people said, well, of course, men are more intelligent than women. And what do we know after a few years? And remember, this is the rector of Harvard University was saying this to everyone. Well, we know that there's not much evidence supporting this. Why would men would be smarter than women? If you go back to this China study, we don't have evidence of a larger gender gap among the higher performing students. If that was the case, maybe you will think, okay, maybe there are some underlying differences in ability, but they don't find any, the gap being bigger among the top performing students. And then going back to this SAT math example, if that was the case, that the ratio of 13 to 1 was true and men are smarter than women, how can that change over time? This is something by nature. Men are born more intelligent than women. But what we see is that by 2005, that ratio of 13 to 1 was now 2.8 to 1. So women, in a few years, managed to score much higher than men, or like at the same level as men. So if it was something about nature, you would not expect that in such a few years, this ratio would change so much. So we don't have evidence for this. So it must not be something about men being smarter than women. But maybe other reasons. For example, the effort. are there gender differences in the effort provision before or during an exam? So there was a study in 2011 saying that, well, maybe this is just men don't take these low stakes tests seriously because they don't have any bearing in actual decisions such as college placement or any type of educational opportunities. So basically what they are saying is men do not exert much effort when the test doesn't matter, because what's the point? They are going to exert effort when the test matters. So it could be something about preparation. They don't prepare the same for the mock test, but then they prepare well for the real test. Or maybe it could be that both men and women have the same level of preparation, but men just choose to exert less effort in the mock test because it doesn't really count. So what do we know from research about this? It is really hard to disentangle these different explanations. We do have some evidence in support of this. So in the Gaokao exam, the paper from China, they did a survey of the students taking the mock exam about the mock exam and about the real Gaokao test. And they asked them questions, for example, how many hours did they study, how did they study, etc. And they find that there were no differences between men and women in how they prepare for the exam or the self-reported levels of effort during the exam. So from that paper, we say, well, this is unlikely to be an explanation. However, it may depend on who the students are. And remember, this Gaokao paper is in China. So this next paper by a group of economists finds that US students, but not Chinese students, improve the performance in the PISA test when they are given an incentive. And remember, the PISA test is a low-stakes test. Basically, the OECD administers this test every year in many countries, but the actual result in the test doesn't matter for anything. So what are the incentives of students to perform well? What's interesting is that in the schools in Shanghai, where they gave these monetary incentives to students, so basically they go to the classroom and they say, we're going to pay you this much if you improve your performance in this test. And they do that in China, and they do that in some schools in the US. And what they find is that the Chinese students were already performing at their max, so no external incentive would help them improve performance. But in the US, they find that actually students perform better when they are paid to perform better, meaning that maybe this explanation of the effort could be partially there. Not for the Chinese students. And remember, the first paper is about the Gaokao exam in China. But for other students who may not have the enough intrinsic motivation, having some sort of external incentive in a low-stakes test can help them improve performance. They do not mention anything about gender in this paper, so we don't know if this was differential by gender. My guess is that it wasn't, and that's why they don't. I don't think they find any gender differences here. Yet another reason, maybe this is something about the expectations of society and of parents that are different for boys and girls. Or maybe this is something about the returns on the labor market for a woman having an education than for a man having an education. You know that there's a gender gap in salaries or in wages, and maybe this is something reflecting that women expect not to be paid as well as men, and that's why maybe they don't perform so well in this type of tests. There could be differences in what men and women are expected from parents. For example, if men fail, maybe they are given more chances to retake an exam, to try again. But maybe we hold girls to a different standard, which is you are nice, you have to be nice, you have to be perfect, you don't fail. And over time, if we raise our kids in this way, there may be important differences by the time they reach 15 or 18 years old and they are taking these exams. So this is, of course, something that we cannot test with this type of research, but it's something for us to think about, whether how we raise boys and girls may affect their fear of failure, may affect what they think parents and society expects of them, and how that can affect the way that they approach this test and the way that they feel when they don't perform well in the test, or the way they deal with pressure in a test. So another way of saying this is that the returns for women to performing well may be lower than the returns for men of doing well, and that may affect how you actually perform in the test or how much effort you put in the test. An alternative way of putting this is maybe the actual stakes for women are higher than for men. Because, and if you think about maybe in a context different than Norway, maybe in a developing country, if you don't perform well in this exam as a girl, you are married off and having kids in 1 year. If you perform poorly in a test as a boy, maybe you are just going to try again next year. So these differences in society of how what we expect of boys and girls can actually play a big role in what are the stakes that boys and girls are facing. Unfortunately, I don't have any research backing up this, but just to for you to keep in mind that the way we raise our kids may be affecting how they perform in this type of situations, or the way we expect them to perform in the test or later on in life can affect how they deal with pressure in a test. So what are the consequences? I've talked to you about for, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes about these gender differences, the evidence on gender differences in high-stakes exams performance. But does it really matter? Well, what we know from research, and this is very recent research, is that it creates a disadvantage for the women at the top, the very best ones, the ones that can achieve a lot in terms of the educational opportunities that they can get. So there is this very interesting research from September 2022. So this is just out of the oven, exploiting a change in Spain where basically the admissions to college are based on two things, and similar to Norway. One is your grades in high school, and one is your performance in a high-stakes exam. What changed the reform was what's the weight of the exam portion. So what they look at is whether when you increase the weight of this exam in the whole of, in how they are doing admissions, what happens with the outcomes of men and women. And they find that it doesn't affect enrollment. Men and women are equally likely to be enrolled in college. What it affects is the quality of the degrees or of the colleges that women are enrolled into. So they find that female students in the most selected degrees declines, so meaning that those top choices now are less attainable for women. And they also say this along with their career prospects. If you don't manage to get into one of these prestigious programs, then your career is not going to be as good as if you had managed to. Who are more to lose with this type of reform or with this type of setting? They are the women who tend to do better in college. So they are harming the top women, the ones who have the chance to do the best. They are the ones who are harmed by basically having a higher weight of the exam in the way in the admission for college. So they conclude basically saying that rewarding high-stakes performance in selection processes may come along with gender differences unrelated to the determinants of subsequent performance. So basically what they're saying is that maybe because of this pressure that generates a high-stakes exam, we are creating gender differences in educational outcomes that are not related to their true ability. They were very good to begin with, but now with this test, they are not going to be as good because they don't have access to these good educational opportunities. So moving gears a bit, I'm going to talk about the role of the format of the exam, specifically multiple choice tests. And why is this important? Well, a lot of these high-stakes exams are done in this multiple choice format. Why? Well, because this is an easy way to run a test or administer a test in thousands or millions of students at the same time. And what are the goals of this test? At least in principle, they are not meant to harm anyone. They basically want to measure individuals' ability and skills, and they want to compare and select candidates. They want to select the very best. There's no reason why, in principle, when you design a test like this, you think about harming some students or others. However, some recent research shows that maybe we're not measuring the same abilities or skills when we have the same exam, in the way that maybe these performance differences can reflect inequalities in the testing process. There is this interesting paper showing that depending on who is present when you are taking an exam, being, for example, the teacher you are used to, a teacher you are familiar with, versus someone else sent by the government, so an unknown person, can generate gender differences in performance. So when you are more familiar with someone, kids perform in a way. When they are not familiar with the person who is taking care of the exam, they perform in a different way. And the exam is the same. So something as minor as that can affect performance. Maybe it could be the psychological or cognitive factors, as we have been discussing. The reaction to pressure can affect, with the same test, how different types of students may perform. And I've been talking about gender, but maybe gender is not the issue. Maybe it's something about anxiety. If women tend to be more anxious towards tests, that is going to be conflated. Gender and anxiety, it's something about anxious students. It's not about women, it's about anxious students. We don't know that yet, but maybe that's potentially what's going on here. This is the response to stress that anxious students cannot deal very well with in a test, and it happens to be that more women are anxious students. So rather than differences in the underlying ability or skills of students, we may be capturing other things with this type of test that are they are not the idea of the test, but we still capture these inequalities or differences. So here in this literature, we have a recent paper about the performance in the PISA exam when you vary how you ask the questions. For example, do you ask them using a multiple choice format, or do you ask them using an open-ended or type of question, open-ended question? So what this paper finds is that in multiple choice tests, you can see a big gap between the performance of men and women of about, this is 2 percentage points, with girls performing much worse than boys in the multiple choice questions. But when you move to other types of formats, for example, the open-ended questions, then that gap goes down. So the same questions asked in 2 different ways can change the gender gap in the math performance in the PISA test. Other factors may also matter. And there's a large literature now finding that women tend to skip more questions in multiple choice tests. What is skipping? Is basically, I go to the test, I see a question that maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure of the answer. Suppose that if I get it wrong, I get a penalty for answering it wrong. Instead of getting 1 point, if I answer it right, I get subtracted 0.15, 0.25 points if I get it wrong. So I have to really think, should I answer this question or not? I'm not sure of the answer. If I get it wrong, I get my score goes down. If I get it right, of course it goes up. But there's a risk involved in this decision. So the previous research finds that there's a lower willingness of women to guess in questions that have penalties when you get it wrong. So if there's this threat that your score is going to go down, basically what women do is leave it unanswered, skip the question, they don't answer. More than men. And this guessing can depend on risk aversion, meaning if you are very averse to risk, and this is of course a risky situation, there has been research in economics and psychology showing that women are more risk averse than men. If that is the case, then women will leave more questions unanswered in the test. Hence, their scores are going to be lower. It could also be self-confidence. And there's also research showing that men tend to be more confident than women. This is a risky situation. I don't know which is the right answer, but I think that maybe it's A or maybe it's B. And if I'm self-confident, I'm going to say, okay, I'll just do it. If I'm not confident, then I will be, well, maybe I'll just skip it because the risk is too high and I don't have the confidence to mark some answer. So I'm going to talk a bit about my own work in progress. I wish it was a more finished version at this point, but this is where we are at the moment. And what we're trying to do here is basically, can we replicate these behaviors in an economics lab, in a more artificial, contrived, but controlled setting, so that we can know what's going on? Is this something about maybe women they don't have the confidence, or maybe is it something about the difficulty of the questions, and maybe you don't manage time well? Maybe there are differences in how men and women manage time in a test. So the project that I'm going to talk about is joined with Ingvild Skarpeid. She's a PhD student at NHH, and she's about to finish her degree. So we basically designed this experiment to do two things. The first one is whether and how choking takes place in this more controlled environment. And we want to assess the role of time allocation, how do they move through the test, and confidence. And here we're using 2 competing hypotheses in economics. One is the more standard, which is called the neoclassical hypothesis, which is basically saying if you increase the stakes, and think about the stakes here as monetary stakes. You get more money for every correct question that you get, for example. If you increase the stakes, people are going to increase effort because they want to get this money, so they want to get the question right. And that is going to increase performance. The opposing hypothesis is the more psychological hypothesis, the choking under pressure that we have been talking about, which is I increase the stakes, people are going to exert more effort. However, that effort is not going to lead to an increase in performance, but actually it's going to lead to a decrease in performance because of what we talked before. For example, working memory, you start worrying, I need to do well, otherwise I'm not going to earn the money, and then you end up performing worse than you would have without the increase in the pressure. So the idea here is to try to increase the pressure and see if we can replicate this phenomenon of underperformance and whether we can see a gender difference in underperformance. So what is the design of this experiment? So our participants are going to have 5 minutes to solve 7 questions, which look like a Raven's test type of question. If you are not familiar with this type of questions, it's basically a series of images, and there's a blank square at the end. And basically you have to choose among the options to see what is the image that best completes the pattern. And we're going to have 2 tests, simulating this idea of the mock test and the real test. In the first test, we're going to have a piece rate. You are going to earn 0.20 cents of a British pound per correct question. In the second test, we are going to introduce some variations in the stakes that the participants are going to face. Some people are going to be paid £5 per correct question, so increasing the stakes by a lot. And we're going to have a fixed order of the questions, which is first question is medium difficulty, the second one is hard, third one medium, fourth easy, medium, hard, easy. And the structure of the test is going to be the same in both tests. They don't know that, but that's the structure that they will follow. So what are these treatments, as we call it in economics, that we introduce? So first, we're going to have a pure control. Basically, they don't have any increase in the stakes. They're going to earn 0.2 British pounds per correct question. And they're basically going to do the same test twice with different questions. They don't experience any change from test 1 and test 2, except that the questions are going to be different. Then the second treatment is we introduce a cutoff. And a cutoff means you're going to get the 0.2 British pounds per correct question if you manage to solve 5 questions correctly. If you don't, you get 0. So this is the idea that there may be some cutoffs that people have to go above in order to get a reward, like in the Gaokao exam, as we talked about before. In the third treatment, besides adding this cutoff, we are going to increase the stakes. Now, instead of getting 0.2 British pounds per correct answer, you're going to get 5 British pounds per correct answer, meaning that if you manage to get 5, you're going to get 25 British pounds for work in 4 minutes. So that's a pretty good deal for the people who are our participants. And then the last one is very similar, except that we are going to show this structure of difficulty. This is a hard question, this is a medium question, this is an easy question, because we think, well, maybe sometimes when the stakes are high and you are facing a question that seems easy, you start second-guessing yourself. This cannot be that easy. This exam is hard. The question cannot be that easy. But if someone tells you this is an easy question, then you can, okay, check, move on to the next. So we have a sample of about 1,000 workers. in a platform that's called Prolific. This is an online marketplace where you can hire workers to do some tasks, for example, these type of Raven test exercises, and people get paid for that. So very quickly, what are our results? So remember, two of the key components of choking are stress and motivation. Do we manage to increase both of them? So basically, we have the control treatment. We don't expect anything to happen, right? Because basically, they are just doing the same 2 times. And in these plots, what we have is, did stress increase in test 2 relative to test 1? And what we see is that in all of the 3 treatments, stress increase, especially in the treatment where we pay £5 per correct question. Those 2 treatments, stress goes up by a lot. It doesn't look like it goes up differentially by men and women, only a bit in the treatment where they know the structure of difficulty. It seems that women are having a higher level of stress than men. So at least in this sample, we managed to increase stress, but not so much differentially for men and women. What about motivation? In test 2 relative to test 1, that also increases, only not in the treatment where we add the cutoff, but we don't change the payment. So this is now basically you have to work harder to earn the same. So that, of course, doesn't increase motivation. So that makes a lot of sense. But for the treatments where we pay £5 per correct answer, we see an increase in motivation. So it seems that we have the perfect combination of features that would lead to choking under pressure. Do we see a change in performance between test 2 and test 1? Well, not so much. Basically, the performance of men and women goes down by a bit when the pay is £5 per correct question, but it doesn't change very much relative to the performance of test 1. Do we manage to make them miss the cutoff, meaning they don't get at least 5 questions correct? And that we are a bit more successful with. In the control group, about 65 to 70% of the participants were missing the cutoff, meaning they don't reach 5 questions correct in the second test. And that goes up by about 75% in the treatments where we increase the stakes and we increase the pressure. What is very interesting is that you don't see large differences between men and women here. In this control setting, it seems that, yes, we are inducing some sort of choking under pressure, but it doesn't seem to affect differentially men and women. We also want to take a look at time use. And here we basically plot how many seconds they spent in each of the questions for each of the 4 treatments for men and for women. And there's nothing very striking here, other than maybe men are spending less time in the hard question number 2, and women are spending more time in the medium questions, for example, question number 3 and number 5. So it does seem that men and women use time differently. However, it doesn't mean that they are performing too differently in this setting. So what do we learn or what have we learned so far with this experiment? We can see that this choking behavior can appear in an online anonymous setting. So these workers are working from their own homes. They don't know each other. And we see that the high stakes can harm. We can increase the fraction of people who don't make the cutoff. We were thinking that having this information about the difficulty of the task could help. And in fact, it doesn't. So that is very interesting. Maybe an easy way to alleviate some of the stress in a test would be to say, this is an easy question, this is a hard question, this is a medium question. It doesn't seem to be the case that helps to improve performance. And what's most puzzling for us right now is that we don't see a gender effect. And what we don't know at this point is it because in this type of workers are different from the students in China and from the students in all of the other places that I mentioned before? So is it because it's a very special sample? Or is it because the women are going to perform worse if the stakes were higher? As we were saying before, maybe women are facing higher stakes for the same test if the threat is that basically they are going to get married and have kids, whereas the boys can have a much easier life if they fail. So this is a work in progress, as I mentioned. So we'll hear more about it, hopefully, when we try to figure out what's going on. So some final thoughts. Does anything work to reduce gender gaps in performance? So something that's very obvious and very easy to implement is, well, remove penalties for wrong questions in an exam. So, as I said before, there are large gender gaps in skipping questions, and this is specifically the case among high-performing students. Girls who are very good are much more likely to skip questions, to leave questions unanswered, than girls that are not at that level of performance. In a paper by Kaufman and Klinowski in 2020, they show that after a reform in Chile that basically eliminated the penalties for wrong answers, the gender gap in skipping goes down by 70%, and the performance gender gap goes down by 13%. And before the reform in 2014, men were skipping fewer questions, around from 20 to 30, depending on the year, and women were skipping a bit more, but enough so that the performance was much lower for women. After the reform, this basically shrinks, the two lines shrink, and there's not so much difference between men and women in the fraction of questions that they skip. This goes basically almost to zero, and there's no difference between men and women. So if you are designing a test, or if you know of governments who are designing this type of tests that have penalties, a good advice would be don't have penalties in the tests. That can help women to some extent. Not completely, but to some extent. And then you can think that if this is something relating to stress, maybe there are some interventions or programs that can help. And one point that is not here is that the research by Baylock, the woman who wrote this choke book, Baylock and Ramirez in 2014, they do this psychological intervention where right before the test, they dedicate 10 minutes and they ask students to write about your worries. What is the idea here? Remember, this hypothesis is that working memory is basically loaded with these worries about the exam. Once you verbalize the worries, writing them down, basically you empty your working memory so that you can use that for the performance in the task at hand, which is the test. So they found this to be effective. The problem with a lot of the psychology studies and some of the economic studies is that they have very few participants. So in my study that I showed before, we have 1,000, and even with that, sometimes it's hard to tell differences by gender. In the study by the psychologists Baylock and Ramirez, they have 50 students or 100 students, very few students. This study has been replicated, and it doesn't replicate all of the time, but it does seem that doing this writing exercise can be promising. So if you know that you're stressed and you know that maybe you will be trapped by these thoughts, ruminating thoughts during the test, maybe take a few minutes to write before the test about what makes you worried. That can help. there has been a series of interventions talking about stress mindset and stress management. Stress mindset basically is, how do you interpret stress? How do you interpret maybe having sweaty hands or your heart racing? Do you interpret this as a bad thing, something that is going to harm your performance? Or do you interpret this as, when I feel this, I'm ready to perform? So when you can change this mindset of interpreting these bodily signals as something that is going to hurt me, and instead you think of it as something that you're ready to perform, that can change how you actually perform. So again, some psychologists did this study in the US among disadvantaged students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And what they find is that not necessarily that performance increase when they have this type of interventions, stress management and stress mindset interventions, but that there was no relationship between the stress that the students feel during the exam week and the actual performance in the test. So they managed to break them into two different pieces. It's not going from stress to performance, but they are not correlated anymore. There's also a recent paper by Lea Kassar and co-authors in Economics, where she provides a mindfulness meditation course to some students, and she sees whether the performance improves or not in the short run and in the long run. Short run meaning, do my grades this semester improve, the same semester that I'm taking this mindfulness meditation course, and do my grades in later semesters improve? And what they find is that this type of course makes students perform worse in the current semester, but later on they perform better. So the mechanisms are not very clear. It may be that because you are taking time to do these meditations, you are studying less, and then hence your performance this semester is worse. But once you incorporate them, internalize it into your life, that can help you in the long run. So there's more to come. I'm working on some interventions as well in Colombia, which is my native country. So stay tuned. There's more to know about this, and I hope this at least triggers some interest in the topic. So thank you very much.